interest, we all have examples of where the legislature has divided communities of common interest.
Right.
I guess in the case of my ex-Senate district, I had a territory that went all the way up to Mill Iron Road. Well, from your vantage point in Salem, let's just say somewhere between Eugene and Junction City, and I had grass seed farmers up there, and yet I had the University of Oregon in my Senate constituency.
Yeah.
That seemed to divide communities of interest, the university being in 2 Senate districts at that time, and the grass seed farmers of northern Lane County not being with their maybe friends in southern Lynn County. So they have divided communities of interest. What is the, which of those factors is most important?
Well, equal population is the most important because you're going to run into a federal constitutional problem there. I think the reason why maybe you've seen so much of division of communities of interest is because it's a vague term. That's great. And so there's a lot that the legislature can sort of, a lot of room to maneuver in there. And I'm not aware of a successful suit under that term. But yeah, and my guess is just due to the inherent vagueness of it.
Commissioner Farr.
And sorry for the out of queue question earlier, but my reason for that is because of the 2000 redistricting, which had some pretty imbalanced redistricting. And the senators,
Commissioner.
I'm Representative Farr. The House District 11, for instance. So what does the community of Shed in North Lynn County and the University of Oregon have in common? Well, the same state rep.
Yeah.
And that district wraps all the way around Springfield up to Mackenzie Bridge and around through Sweet Home, through Lebanon, Sweet Union. And my district, House District 14, goes from downtown Eugene, which is a population mass that is like 2001. And it also went all the way out beyond Cheshire. So the farmers out there, they like them too. But there's badly imbalanced, particularly if you look at Eugene, that got sliced up like a pie and pushed way out into the rural district, into the rural area. Whereas Bend, they kept intact and did the entire rural, and Bend is a separate.
Right.
So some political force was at play there, and that was the one that was in my Secretary of State Bradbury.
Yeah, so I have 2 thoughts on that, and I wasn't around for that, so I didn't live through it. I was not living in Oregon at the time, but one is, notice the term is not divide communities of common interest, not the entire amalgam has to be a community of common interest. Now, I gather you're saying they still divided the U of O campus, so, arguably maybe they did that.
Well, this one, it fully has a U.S. campus in it, but it also has Shed.
It was the previous
okay.
one I was referring to.
They're also, to challenge or to object, you have to be bothered by that. It may be that Eugene wanted to be divided, to have a chance of electing 3 representatives. I don't know the story. I wasn't here for that, but.
Linda and I were going through a different redistricting at the time in 2000. It was pretty strenuous in the city of Eugene.
Kelly.
Oh, and Kelly actually was the one that worked it. Yeah, you were the one that drew the crazy lines that we had to fix.
Commissioner Bernie.
Could you define common interest?
Well, I'll give you what the state Secretary of State has given us. Urban neighborhoods, rural communities, or other communities. I mean, that's really as far as it goes.
It really doesn't scratch the surface if one wanted to identify what common interests people have.
Yeah, I was at a forum with the late Secretary of State Dennis Richardson and some other folks who've worked in this area for a while, and I remember somebody in the room said for one round of redistricting, a community of common interest was a basketball league, a high school basketball league. So it's very flexible. And there have been some who've wanted, or I remember at that meeting, folks wanted more definition from the Secretary of State on what that would mean. But, right now it's a pretty flexible term.
Thank you.
Commissioner Rosevich.
Thanks. I just wanted to note that I just handed out to the rest of the commissioners a copy of the guidelines that were given by then Secretary of State Kate Brown. when we started our redistricting, these were the guidelines she provided to local governments to do their redistricting, which basically are the same as the state statute. And on the back side of that is a section of our charter that describes our districts as
Right.
the charter describes them. And it has what it says scenario 1 was the 2001 adopted districts. And then scenario 8 is the scenario that got adopted in 2011. So it's kind of a quick reference for anybody.
Can I get a copy of that too?
Thanks, sure.
I could share. Yeah, that's fine.
And I'm sorry, I
I actually have
apologize.
a couple
Yeah.
copies.
I'm gonna request from staff to create slides that could superimpose one of these over the other so we can actually see visually the changes that were made leading up to this. That would be great.
You can do
Yeah,
this.
kind of do
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Kind of got to do
But
the flipping
easier.
back and forth thing a little bit.
I'm sorry.
And
But-
it just, you may know this as our speaker, but I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that we have several members of the League of Women Voters here.
So, just taking a quick glance at this memo, and I thank you for sharing it with me. I hadn't seen this before. I'm always a little skeptical of this notion of traditional districting principles, just because I think there's a lot of disagreement as to what those are. So whenever somebody says that, I would just say, have your antenna up and kind of really question, what do you mean by that? Exactly what do you mean by traditional? Because there are disagreements. If you want, and I'll talk about this a little later, if you are drawing, let's say, partisan districts for a partisan office, which the county commission is not, but state legislature, you might want partisan balance in your district to elect moderate legislators. You might want that. That's probably going to lead to sort of a screwy-looking district, because you're going to be trying to do whatever you can to get an even number of Ds and Rs and unaffiliated. But some people want that. Some people would consider that a traditional districting principle, as opposed to just compactness and contiguousness. So there is sometimes tension among these principles, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is what our House districts look like right now, our state House districts. And then the Senate districts, as you know, are a composite of two of these. And then here's Eugene. For Portland, you have to zoom in, obviously, due to the population density. And so this is all the result of complying with that equal population mandate for one person, one vote. Who draws the state legislative and congressional districts? In most states, it's elected officials, i.e. politicians. And so some people view that as a conflict of interest because state legislators draw the very districts in which they will run. And then state legislatures also draw congressional districts. Congressmen, congresswomen don't draw those. But in some states, as we're seeing more of, and maybe we'll see it in Oregon, there's an effort to put this on the ballot from the League of Women Voters. There are independent or bipartisan, or sometimes they're called nonpartisan commissions, who either have the sole authority to draw districts, and actually a case went to the U.S. Supreme Court about that, and the court upheld the authority of the Arizona Redistricting Commission to draw Arizona's congressional districts. Only 5-4, by the way, but they upheld it. And then there are others who advise. And there are all kinds of different schemes. Iowa, for instance, has nonpartisan staff draw up its state legislative and congressional districts, and then it basically sends them to the legislature for an up or down vote. And they can reject them and send them back, but then it's the nonpartisan staff who work on them again. Other states like Wisconsin and Oregon traditionally, it's just a regular legislative committee. And then it goes to the floor of the House or the Senate, just like any old bill, and it comes out of that process.
If they can't come to agreement in Oregon, the Secretary of State draws the districts.
Which happened in 2000.
Right. But eventually it goes to the Secretary of State here. Gerrymandering, it sounds like you're all familiar with that term. This is the required slide for any talk on gerrymandering, the original gerrymander. Looks like our other speakers here.
Looks like House District 11 to me.
Hi.
At this juncture, might I'm sorry.
If you flipped it.
And
Could
so,
I ask what,
yeah.
could I ask what the League of Women Voters is advocating for in a statewide initiative? I think it's
Independent commissions. Independent permission to do the redistricting.
Gotcha. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, an independent district. This is Elbridge Gary. Somehow the name for the term became gerrymandering, but that's how you pronounced his name, apparently, I've learned over the years, who was the original gerrymander for a congressional seat in Massachusetts way back when, and the term has just stuck. These are some of the seemingly obvious gerrymandering examples out of the post 2010 redistricting cycle. And I say down below where they're from. The one on the top right is known as Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. And then this one's called the Praying Mantis. And so most of these are thought to have been the result of a process that was designed to perhaps benefit one party over the other. Although, if you go back and look at some of the gerrymanders over time, or alleged gerrymanders, sometimes they're done, like in many of the southern states, to create a majority-minority district. And so some of the southern states have said, we had to do this, we had to draw a district like this to comply with the Voting Rights Act, so that not everyone in our congressional delegation would be white. We wanted to have a majority African-American district. And there's a lot of litigation about that. I'm not going to get into that in detail here. But I just want to caution that funny shapes don't necessarily mean a motive that we would all think was bad. It's just kind of simplistic, I think, a lot of times to say, funny shape, therefore bad. Not always.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Which one of those is the North Carolina district where they put the district along a freeway? Is that North Carolina 12?
Let's see, that may be this one, NC 12, yeah.
And now, in the case of Oregon, where we have minority communities, racial minority communities, but we don't have as much of a racial minority population as, say, New Jersey or Florida or North Carolina, is of all of the reasons for why districts are created, it seems like the most egregious example where courts would intervene is where there's a racial component to the decision of the districtors or redistrictors. Is that a fair statement? In other words, these
Well-
other factors, like, unless it's really outrageous, like a 20% variance in population, or that usually it's the concept of racially motivated to harm a racial minority.
So that's kind of.
That's where the courts would get involved. Otherwise, all these other phrases like common interest, or even the word equality, if it's mostly equal, courts will not get involved.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I guess one response is that that's where we've ended up. There was some time, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, where folks, litigants, different public interest groups thought maybe the Supreme Court would issue a decision limiting or prohibiting partisan gerrymandering, and the Supreme Court decided not to. But in that decision recently, they said, but we will still strike down racial gerrymandering. The other aspect is you have to go back a ways for this. In the 90s, the U.S. Supreme Court actually struck down some majority-minority districts. There was a case, Shaw v. Reno, in 1995. Janet Reno, former Attorney General out of North Carolina, where the Supreme Court said, even if you're trying to help a racial minority, a district that is too grotesque looking can violate the Constitution. And that's out of the line of jurisprudence of racial discrimination. Any which way is wrong or illegal, and there's a lot of dispute about that, I recognize, but that's where Shaw v. Reno came out of. So, but yeah, that's mostly the case. That yes, the courts are more skeptical of racial gerrymanders. And so this is the case I mentioned or alluded to, Rucho versus Common Cause, just decided last summer, where the U.S. Supreme Court held that partisan gerrymandering claims are
Exists.
not justiciable.
Adopted.
For the non-lawyers here, I know we have some lawyers, but not justiciable means the courts just won't hear them. At least the federal courts won't hear them. They are so-called political questions, okay? And that was by only a vote of 5-4, and the dissents were very vigorous, but
really interesting.
that's where we stand right now. And so what that leaves is the door open for litigation under state constitutions, which we've seen a lot of, both before and after Rougeau. And then also state constitutional and statutory reform, like the movement toward independent districts, district and commissions. So while a lot of folks were.
Excuse me just a
Oh,
second.
yeah.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, but I want to be able to give our speaker the respect for listening to his
So, you know,
presentation.
Sorry, I was just sharing some racial data from our districts with Commissioner Bernie. I'll stop.
well, while a lot of folks were sort of disheartened who are pushing for reform by this decision, Rougeau versus Common Cause, you are seeing a lot of states pass ballot measures establishing independent districting commissions. Of course, you need the direct democracy in place to do that. Only about 20 out of 50 states have that. So if you're in a state that doesn't have direct democracy, and people are worried about a legislature that's keeping itself in power, it's kind of hard to get around that. But here in Oregon, if people are concerned, we have the ballot measure process that we all know so well. So how to cure partisan gerrymandering? Well, we have to decide what we care about the most, and I was talking about this earlier. Do we want equal representation of the parties, or at least do we want the parties to get an equal number of seats based on the percentage of statewide vote they win? Often in case there is what political scientists call partisan asymmetry, meaning Democrats win 51% of the statewide vote for state house, but they only get like 40% of the seats, or vice versa. There's a lot of very sophisticated political science literature on this, and so some people may want districts that kind of move more toward that. Maybe you care about geography more, but that is sometimes in tension with this. Same thing with competitive. I was mentioning earlier, you could try to draw districts that have even numbers of voters because you want, hard-fought races. But that means you may have to relax some of this. And then racial representation, if you want to have, two congressmen who are African-American, who are likely to be African-American from Mississippi, you may have to draw some districts that don't look as compact as they would otherwise, because you're trying to kind of keep that population together, or a majority together. So these goals are often in conflict with each other, and so one thing I always say to folks who are more reform-minded is, you have to decide what your goals are. And two examples of that are that California, apparently, in its redistricting commission, adopted about 10 years ago, really focused on keeping communities of interest together, but they have the top two primary system, or the jungle primary. And their idea was, we'll get competition when we get to the end, where we have two Democrats facing each other. Okay, so we're not so concerned about that final race being competitive. Whereas Arizona, when they adopted an independent redistricting commission, one of the goals the commission was given was, we want competitive partisan races. We want fairly even numbers of R's and B's. That's very different from the track California took. So even among reformers, you kind of have to figure out what you're aiming for. Local redistricting, well, as we see here, like in Lane County and I guess just a handful of other counties in Oregon that have districts, most don't, is my impression. We're talking about nonpartisan elections. Unlike legislatures who aren't always subject to these, everything county commissions do when they redistrict, at least in Oregon, as I understand it, are subject to fairly strict open meeting laws.
Not here.
So that's one way in which maybe is a little different from the legislative process. This slide I put on just for fun, or this quote. So I was reading an article about local redistricting, and I thought you guys might find this a little obnoxious. That's what these two professors said about local districting. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act does apply at the local level. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits otherwise neutral voting systems that have discriminatory results. Where you see the most litigation about this in the last 20, 30 years, often in the South, but not exclusively. And it's usually lawsuits challenging at-large city council systems, sometimes county commission, but usually at-large, saying that, well, okay, maybe this is a 60-40 white-black town, and we have 10 city councilors, and they're all elected at large, and they're all white. And so some of the lawsuits that have been successful under the Voting Rights Act at the local level have been on that basis, that, well, you know, if you have a 40% black community, they need to have the chance to elect somebody from their community. And so several of those suits have succeeded or settled and led to the changing of districts from at-large to district. Of course, here we are district anyway, so not something that applies in Lane County, but yeah.
Couple of questions. Commissioner Farr and then Commissioner Brady.
Actually, mine was just a general one that maybe all you have is your opinion, and maybe you don't want to give that. This all seems Republican, Democrat. What about those among us who are non-affiliated? Is it growing number of us?
Yeah. Well, that is certainly, I guess I have a couple of responses to that. One is, if you're going to reform the system and have some kind of neutral commission, you know, what's the role for the unaffiliated voters? And that's a question you hear a lot, because a lot of these commissions traditionally were, you know, 7 Dems, 7 Rs, and a judge or something. And I think we're seeing more discussion of, well, let's have a role for unaffiliated. But I think when you get back to concerns about, you know, partisan balance, this equal representation of parties, I think what folks are looking at there is just the results from the district. So you may have unaffiliated voters who often vote one way or the other.
So that they're kind of a non-ender. They likely will split, or the
No, they likely vote one way or the other,
I see.
right? And so we can look at the macro data to get a sense of that.
Okay.
You know, that's the discussion I've seen at least.
In the state, I only know of one non-affiliated, and that was Bob Jensen, who served as a Democrat, non-affiliated, and as a Republican in the House. And you served as Bob, I think. We were in the Senate when Bob was in the House. But, that exhausts my question. Thank you.
Commissioner Brady.
It doesn't fully exhaust it, because I'm going to pursue that a bit. All this, I find, and I'm prepared for you to tell me I'm wrong, but I find all the arguments discussed thus far somewhat weak. And it reminds me 45 years ago when I got my degrees in economics, they were saying, this doesn't work anymore. We don't know the new economic tools, but this is what we got. Phillips curve, opportunity cost, all that stuff. Now we live in an era where I believe there are more independent voters, not necessarily independent party, than either Republicans or Democrats. We seem to live in an era where the fringes of those two parties oftentimes define who candidates will be for partisan offices, whereas there is a middle. It seems like, and even there is the assumption that if you're black, you vote one way, and if you're white, you vote another. And so please respond to that unless it's academic, but it just seems so, to me, weak, these arguments or these kinds of considerations.
And let me just kind of figure out where you're coming from. They seem weak in response to something?
In response to the realities of the world that we live in today.
Yeah. Well, and what are you trying to get at when you say they're weak? When you say you want something stronger to get at?
I'm not. I don't
or?
have. Unlike some commissioners, I don't have the answers to my questions.
Okay.
I just. I'm observing it. I'm asking if those observations are correct, and I guess if what I would get at if I were getting at something, is if these tools are incorrect to inform redistricting.
Yeah.
Why are we stuck with them?
Well, you know, I think the reality might be a little, I might disagree a little bit on how I would describe the reality.
Please.
And this goes back to my answer to Commissioner Farr's comment, which is, I think while we do have an increasing number of unaffiliated voters, I think a lot of them really do side one way or the other. There was actually just a really interesting, I can send this to you, really interesting piece in Politico, I think, about some political scientist somewhere who's kind of doing this cutting edge work, that there is no such thing as a swing voter anymore. That swings in elections are all explained by who stays home and who shows up. It's not about people actually crossing their tickets or, the independent who votes this way, this cycle, and this way, another cycle. It's just about who shows up which cycle. And I don't know how correct she is, but, it's an interesting take that's a little different from yours. Well, all these unaffiliated are kind of, they vote Republican or Democrat, or they split the ticket. And so I think we're still trying to figure out what the reality is. I think we know that we do have more and more, at least when we get to partisan races, not as much for nonpartisan, a geographically divided electorate in many states, certainly in Oregon, but even more so in, Wisconsin or Ohio or Michigan, where you have the cities who tend to vote Democratic and the rural areas who tend to vote Republican, and then the suburbs and exurbs are kind of somewhere in between. And I think what some of these, at least reform efforts are trying to get at is, well, are we happy with what that produces? It produces people from the rural areas who are on the fringe of maybe the Republican Party, and it produces people from the cities who are what some would say on the fringe of the Democratic Party. And if we want people more in the middle, how do we get there?
And
Now-
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It sounds to me as if another reform effort is who decides. If I can
Exactly,
do that.
yeah, who decides? And I'm just saying, as part of that effort of who decides, we have to decide what criteria we want them to apply. What's more important to us? Are competitive elections more important than kind of having an accurate reflection of a particular community? Because then there may be tension between them.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Commissioner Sorensen has one more
oh,
question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Could I just ask a question about the request that's been made to me, and that is that, and I'm not going to be here when the Board of Commissioners or whoever decides the districts for the next round, because I'm not running for re-election, so my term is running out. But I've been asked by people in my district, is it permissible for the Board of Commissioners to rebalance what some have alleged was a gerrymandering when the board last did this, and rebalance it by means of not a partisan balance, because these are nonpartisan offices, but by an interest, a concern that the interests have been so defined by the current districting, namely that there was a packing of the progressive vote in Lane County in my district, and that meant that the other districts had fewer progressive voters, and that influenced the way the Board of Commissioners operated over the ensuing 10 years. And they want to know, given all of this litigation that goes on
Yeah.
over what are the motives of redistricting, could the so-called progressive or conservative or progressive regressive or progressive not progressive constituencies be more fully balanced in the next redistricting? Is that something that in your view would be proper?
I think
lawful?
it's certainly among the legitimate options. If what you want is, and we'll take party labels away, but talk about just ideology, and let's say we could slap
Yeah.
an ideological label on voters.
Yeah.
If you want
Maybe
more,
not on individual voters, as Commissioner Bernie pointed out, but
Yeah.
on groups.
on
of
groups, yes, exactly. I think that there's certainly a legitimate argument that you want to spread progressive voters around rather than not have them all bunched in one district.
Well, my mother and I thought it was a fine idea to have the progressive voters in my district, because it
right.
happened to match my
Right.
political outlook.
So there's a great book on this that I'd recommend to all of you, but especially in response to this question, called Why Cities Lose by a political scientist at Stanford named Jonathan Rodden. And he's done all this sophisticated analysis around the world, looking at other democracies like Australia and the UK, and then he especially hones in on the US and particularly Pennsylvania. And his argument is progressive voters tend to bunch up geographically in places like Eugene or in other kind of bigger cities. And because we use compact contiguous districting, for the most part, in the USA, because they use that in England and Australia, progressive candidates tend to translate their votes into fewer seats. That's why his title is Why Cities Lose. So he thinks if you're concerned about that, you should want a proportional representation system.
What's his name?
Jonathan Rodden, R-O-D-D-E-N.
And just to be clear, that's not within our current power in the Board of Commissioners required to redistrict the 5 districts at least once every 10 years.
Yeah, as I read it, I'd have to go look at this law that Kate Brown said as Secretary of State, but it's certainly not within your county charter. You couldn't do it without revising the charter,
Okay.
which I assume takes at least a few years as a process.
Voters have to approve that.
Exactly, yeah, voters
They
have to
haven't
approve the
done
county charter. So I took a look at your charter just briefly in preparation for the talk, and obviously it's something your county council, who's not here, but would study in more
It's another
depth.
commissioner. One of our, we're all.
The county council is a
5.
commissioner?
No,
No,
Oh.
he's
just
he's
thinks
our
he is.
commissioner.
Oh, okay.
Just kidding. I'd say that was-
No.
But, I'd be curious to hear his or her views on this. Under the charter, which of course you're all familiar with, it's interesting to me that the charter actually says we want districts that represent these areas. I mean, you could imagine a situation where this becomes woefully out of sync with the populations, right?
It is currently an issue.
It's currently an issue, great, okay, so that just stood out to me, looking at this thing for the first time ever, was, gee, this could be in tension, what if there is not enough people in West Lane County, arguably, just picking one, to create, enough constituents for a district under one person, one vote. So that was interesting to me, that it not just established 5, but said where they should represent.
Yeah.
It also, I thought this was interesting, it said the population densities of the districts must be reviewed at least every 10 years, instead of the populations. You thought that was odd too? Yeah, it really should just be the populations, not the densities. I mean, you could get at population through density, but it seems like kind of a roundabout way. I don't know why that's in the charter, but somehow it got in there. Notice it says at least every 10 years, you guys could redistrict apparently more if you want to.
I didn't know.
Every 5 years. I mean, the only examples I'm aware of that have been partisan, like in Texas in the mid-2000s when the Republicans took over the state legislature, they redistricted again because they had control of it, and the Democrats left the state and all that. But I'm not aware of kind of like less partisan examples of that, but you could, under this, as I read it, at least every 10 years. This is more of a matter of state and local government law, but you are a home rule county. There is some case law from the Oregon Supreme Courts that home rule cities have kind of extra protection under the Oregon Constitution. That's why I know we have at least one lawyer here, Commissioner Sorensen would appreciate the CF site. This is a city case, but other cases have interpreted home rule counties to probably have the same powers as home rule cities. We've never gotten a clear decision from the Oregon Supreme Court on that, but given that, I say it's likely Lane County has more control over its districting process than a statutory county would. But as I read your charter, you're not doing anything radical or out of line with Oregon or federal law. Thank you, Jeff, for adding the slide. These are your current districts, which you're all familiar with, of course. I suppose they comport with this requirement of the charter that you have West Lane, sort of. Okay, West Lane, Springfield, South Eugene, North Eugene, and East Lane. So these are some issues to consider as you embark on this process. Of course, population equality. I was talking with Commissioner Sorensen about this earlier. What kind of deviation is allowed under federal constitutional law, at least? Most people think you can go up to 10%. The Supreme Court has allowed that, at least in a state legislative case. No case involving a county commission or a city council has reached the Supreme Court, but folks in this area kind of take that to mean you have up to 10% wiggle room. There is another case that went as far as 16.6%, but the state legislature needed a justification, and the justification there was following local boundaries. Okay, so as high as 16.6% deviation has been allowed by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, you may want to just keep it equal anyway, but it looks like up to 10% is what current precedent allows. Here's a question if we really want to open a Pandora's box or a can of worms. This whole time I've been talking about one person, one vote, population. What do we mean by person? Huge question. Okay, does a person include a child who can't vote? Does it include a non-citizen who can't vote? A few jurisdictions allow non-citizens, but most don't. Does it include military personnel, prisoners? That's been an issue. Okay. Most governments, Charles is going to talk more about the census data, most governments just use residents. There's been a movement in the last 5-10 years by some folks, usually more affiliated with the Republican Party, usually what we would call conservative, to use CVAP, Citizens of Voting Age Population. Okay, and in fact, someone brought and I put the VAP in there, just voting age population, but that would include non-citizens as another option. But somebody brought a case against a Texas city council district saying, you use residents, I'm a citizen. And, my district has way more CVAPs in it, Citizens of Voting Age Population, than the Latino district over here that has more immigrants who aren't citizens. So my vote as a CVAP is being diluted. That's unconstitutional. Okay, and that case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Evenwell is the name, E-V-E-N-W-E-L. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a very kind of perfunctory opinion, just said, no, it's okay if the state just wants to use total residents. But it didn't rule out that using CVAP might be okay. So, the way a lot of changes tend to work in the law is through camel's nose under the tent. Some people think that the reason why the current administration wanted to put the citizenship question on the census was to get CVAP data, so that state legislatures that want to use CVAP could say, aha, 2021, now we're going to do our state legislative seats based on CVAP, not based on residents. No state does that I'm aware of currently, but it's being talked about more.
Commissioner Burney, then Commissioner Sorensen.
So, at this point in time, without that question, I presume the census data does not make that distinction. Consequently,
Charles will probably talk about this more, or do you want to answer
I
that?
might as well talk about it now because it's
Yeah.
not in the presentation. But yeah, when the redistricting data comes out, you'll get the total population at the block level and the 18 and over population at the block level. So VAP is available, but Professor Diller is correct. They would have had to put a citizenship question on the census in order to get that CVAP at the block level. There are estimates of it at the block group or census tract level, come from the American Community Survey, because that survey, which replaced the long form of the census, does ask about citizenship. And so there's a line in the tables of citizen voting age population at larger geographic areas.
so, thank you. So but at this point in time, since the census measures everybody, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And we're, at this point in time, looking at district boundaries by that measurement, all this is somewhat speculative.
Yes, it's purely hypothetical, just to show you
Thank you.
the issues that one could consider.
Thank
Although
you.
the state of Alabama was suing the Department of Commerce just recently, trying to get citizenship data for that reason.
For districting?
Yeah, well, I didn't read the whole.
Alabama, I can't imagine.
Yeah, the state of Alabama was bringing suit. At the same time, the state of New York was suing to keep citizenship off.
Right.
The state of Alabama was suing to put citizenship on.
Commissioner Sorensen.
With regard to the population data that the Board of Commissioners would be using for determining relatively equal population of the 5 districts, would we be allowed to use the basic population data that the census provides to us in December of 2020? In other words, not foreigners, not taking out people that the
Oh, yeah.
census doesn't count. In other words,
Certainly, so.
even though children can't vote
Yeah.
or foreigners can't vote, they are still being counted, as I
Right.
understand it, in the census.
Oh, yeah, and.
And then can we use that, or do we have to use registered voters
No,
or
no.
voters
It's already-
or people who could be voters if they wanted to be voters?
Right, yeah, no, so what even well established or made clear was that it's perfectly fine for any jurisdiction to just use the total residents they get from the census.
The total enumerated persons,
Persons as persons,
Okay.
yeah, not excluding anybody.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but it didn't rule out states doing what maybe Alabama's thinking about, which
As
is,
far as I know, we have always, and I've been involved in 3 redistrictings at this level.
yeah,
First as a member of the advisory committee to the board, and then later on the board. And in those, we always use just the census data. We
Right.
didn't try to cherry pick which
Right.
type of data, like
Yeah.
children would be excluded or whatever.
right, and in fact, interestingly, the defendant in the Evenwell case was Greg Abbott, governor of Texas. And he defended, and Texas defended its use of total residents on the basis of administrative ease. These are the numbers you get from the census. It's gonna take it'd be a lot harder for us to kind of try to pick out CVAP.
That was
So the
sort of my
Supreme-
point.
So the Supreme Court said, sure, that's fine, just use residents.
Mm-hmm.
Process, I haven't been around here for the previous cycles. I'm just some ideas I've come across as far as processes that any county commission could consider. Presumably, it's too late to establish a commission, either advisory or autonomous, but some local governments have done that. San Francisco, San Diego, and New York, for instance, New York City have used autonomous commissions that had, kind of like California or Arizona with state legislatures, these are commissions that had the total authority to draw the boundaries for city council districts and took it completely out of the city council's hands. I read a review of that where the professors who reviewed this thought that it had mixed results. They thought in some ways it actually magnified the input of the well-organized groups who could show up at all those commission hearings, because certain neighborhoods would show up at every single hearing and kind of get more say in the process. So these folks at least had kind of mixed views on that. Obviously, you likely want any process to be inclusionary, open to the public. If you do use a commission, you get into the whole question of how do you select them? Even if they're advisory, are they appointed by you, or are they separately elected, or, that's
That is
a big-
also a question we have currently.
Okay, yeah, that's a big part of the debate at the state level, that I think is just starting to filter down to the local level as local governments start to think more and more about this. Now, the goals, as I see it, the goals that you, as a commission, have to consider are largely dictated by your charter, which lay out, where these districts roughly have to represent. And then another thing that I would imagine needs to be considered during the process are any Voting Rights Act implications. I'm not familiar enough with the demographics here, but, you could imagine a scenario where you have 5 districts, and where they meet is right in the middle of the Latino community. And so if the districts were drawn differently, maybe you'd have a Latino majority district, but because they all meet right in the middle, you've divided that community in 5. You could imagine that. I'm not saying that's what you have here. And then you might get into a Voting Rights Act problem. That's obviously the kind of thing your county council would have to look at. And those are the kinds of concerns that are often raised ahead of time. Hey, we're a community here, Asian, African American, whatever. We need to have the ability to elect a member of our community. And so that's something else to think about during the process. So I had a little further reading here I'd recommend. There's not a lot out there in the academic literature, but there's a little bit on local districting. There's so much about congressional and state legislative, especially about congressional, but there's a little bit out there on the local process that I recommend to you for further reading. So at that, I'll stop, happy to answer questions, and appreciate being here. Thanks.
Thank you.
This is also confusing.
Commissioner Sorensen, then Commissioner Farr.
And I'm not entirely sure on this, but my understanding is the Lane County Charter gives the Lane County Board of Commissioners the responsibility to do the redistricting. There are people out in the community that have suggested, well, the commissioners, what did the nice law review say? They were less sophisticated than higher office holders. Not really sure that's true, but
Yeah.
I guess that is someone's.
Been higher on this whole-
Yeah, right. That might be someone else's opinion. But anyway, assuming that we wanted to move to a different type of districting or redistricting, do you have a recommendation on a fair way of having a group of people do that other than the officials who reside in the districts that are being potentially manipulated?
Sure. I don't have a recommendation I've thought through very carefully. I would think you want to be very sensitive about how you appoint people. Like I know in California, they have people apply. And they make it very clear that there's an application process. They have some process that has different firewalls, like to try to prohibit partisan influence, where they select some people and those people select others, and just kind of like multiple stages, so that it's not just legislators picking their friends or party affiliates. But so you'd certainly want to have it be well advertised, inclusive. And then I guess you'd want to think a little bit about whether you care about partisanship. Do you want to have a guarantee that no party can have more people on that commission than the other? Or do you say we're nonpartisan, we don't care? I don't know. I'm not steeped in the politics here. But when it comes to the commissions that have been given authority to redistrict state legislative chambers or Congress, most of them have been very careful about even partisan arrangements.
Commissioner Farr?
Thank you. Can I spend a full day listening to you? This is really
If you want, sure.
absolutely fascinating, but based on my experience, I'm going to make a motion. I move that Kelly Osborne be given exclusive authority to draw the lines. Will Jack said that? No.
I'm not sure if she wants that.
Seems to have died for lack of a second.
So interestingly, what happened in Eugene in 2000 is a great example of formerly badly, the city had grown weirdly around the lines, and I don't know that Lane County's grown weirdly around the lines, other than probably more of a denser population in the Springfield area. So I think my personal feeling on this is make it as easy and innocuous as possible, and I would personally love to see maybe 5 judges do everything and then just hand it to us autonomously. So the question of an autonomous committee is the question that I have. Do you have any experience with that? Have you seen that actually personally?
No, I don't have any personal experience. Having lived here in Oregon, we don't really have that.
Yeah.
But I know that California and Arizona would be the state level commissions that have gotten the most attention and the most media attention. And in Arizona, it's also been fairly acrimonious. The governor didn't like what they were doing, so he tried to cut their budget, and they sued to get their budget back. And so once you establish it, it's not always hunky-dory.
Okay.
But what I'm not familiar with, and this has kind of piqued my interest in looking into it further, is how it was done locally in New York, San Francisco, and San Diego. I'm curious what exactly their processes were. I'd say if you're interested, I'd look up on what those cities have done. I guess San Francisco is also a county, actually. So see how they did it.
It's probably not going to happen here. I'll say this, that my son has a PhD in political theory.
Oh, wow.
From the University of Virginia. And I love debating political theory. The difference talking with you is that sometimes when you're talking, I get to talk too.
Difference between a PhD and a JD, I guess.
I hope he doesn't
Speaking of
want.
which, PhD.
Commissioner
Well-
Burke, did you have something? Okay.
Another
Please.
question?
No,
Nope, I think
Okay.
we're good.
other than thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Fascinating, thank you.
Well, I don't have a PhD, but I've been working with census data professionally for 35 years. So I know that the topic today is redistricting, and there's some of that in here, but there's also a little bit about the 2020 census in general, my expertise, and hopefully material that will interest you. As I mentioned, there's no more long form. We use the American Community Survey for those social and socioeconomic questions. People still ask us questions like, what was the median household income in the 2010 census? Well, there was no long form, there was no income question on the 2010 census. That comes from the American Community Survey. And we could spend all day talking about the American Community Survey, but there's only, last time around, in 2010, the Census Bureau liked to brag that there were only 10 questions on the census. It's equivalent to what we used to call the short form. And that's still true. I don't know if it's 10, because there's other questions about what's your phone number for follow-up. But there's really only, 6 or 7 substantial demographic questions: age, sex, race, and relationship. That is, they don't ask you if you're married, but whoever puts themselves down in person one, in the first column is the householder. Years ago, they used to say head of household, but somebody has to put themselves down in the first column. So anytime you see data about, African American households, it's not really the household, it's households with an African American householder, person who put themselves in the first column. Same with age, households with a householder 65 and over. And then everybody else in the census is, there's a question about relationship. How is this person related to person one? So again, they're not really asking if you're married, but perhaps person two is a spouse of person one. And that's how they derive data about, for example, married couple families. They also ask if your home is owned or rented. So that's valuable information. We also get, whether the home is occupied or not. And there's some confusion there too, because they can only count everybody once in one place. So the vacancy, when you see a vacancy rate from the census, it tends to look a lot higher than what a real estate agent might tell you the vacancy rate is, because the vacant includes seasonals, it includes turnover. There may be a unit in an apartment building that's already been rented, but people haven't moved in yet. It includes, housing units that may be currently unlivable. So it's, vacancy rate is something we derive from there. And, again, we could talk more about the ACS, but I'm going to talk about 2020. And this is the way they used to do things in the 1960s. Geographer at the Census Bureau using a magnifying glass and a ruler laying on a map. So after the 2010 census, there's only 435 seats in Congress. So that's not changing, and hasn't changed in about 100 years. So every year, every 10 years, there's winners and losers. Our neighbors to the north in Washington gained a seat after the 2010 census, and California, for the first time ever, didn't change. And then those states around the Great Lakes and plus Louisiana and Upper Midwest lost seats. The green states lost. Ohio and New York lost 2. Texas gained 4, and Florida gained 2. So because Oregon didn't quite make it to get a new extra seat, we thought we were on track, but then when the recession hit and our in-migration slowed down, we didn't quite fell short by about 40,000 people in 2010 of getting that sixth seat. So currently, each representative in Oregon represents about 100,000 more people than the average nationwide. And good news is we are expected to get that sixth seat after the 2020 census. These are after the Census Bureau came out with their 2019 population estimates. This organization, Election Data Services, made this map showing basically if they reapportion based on the 2019 estimates, these are the winners and losers. And even California has not grown as fast as the US, so they're likely to lose a seat. Minnesota is fighting hard to count everybody, but they may lose a seat. Texas, again, is going to gain multiple seats. Then they did a different scenario. If, based on the change between the 2018 and 2019 population estimates, that rate of growth, if that were to continue for another 9 months from July 2019 through April 2020, slightly different scenario, Texas would gain yet another seat, and Alabama would lose one. Another reason Alabama was interested in not counting citizens, because their non-citizen population is about 4%, 4 or 5%, versus I think over 12% for the nation. So if apportionment were based on citizenship, much less redistricting, this map would look different. So let's prognosticate about what's going to happen in Oregon. Fun stuff. So we're almost at Census Day, and we think the population of Oregon on Census Day, April 1st, might be about a little less than 4.3 million. Divide that by 6 seats in Congress, and each representative would be representing about 711,000 people. And so these are the current districts. And again, stop me if you have questions. But each, based on the 2018 estimates, every one of Oregon's 5 districts is above that 711,000 threshold. Therefore, every one of them will have to shrink. And
So, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So somebody asked me when I was talking about this, referring to your slide, they said, where's that new district gonna go? And I
Yeah.
think from this, you can see it could go anywhere, right?
Right, but my best guess, and of course I have no control over it, it's up to the legislature, it may be in the mid-Willamette Valley, because the 2 fastest growing districts are 1 and 3 up in the Portland area. So together, they have about 30. They'll have close to 300,000 more people than 2 districts should have. Therefore, they'll have to lose probably from the south end. They may have to lose their Clackamas and Yamhill County portions. Again, just speculating. And then District 2 is quite awkward because it's got all of the 18 counties east of the mountains, plus Jackson County, Medford, plus Grants Pass in Josephine County. So that part, if it ends up being about 140,000, 40,000 above the target, would they have to lose all of Grants Pass and part of Jackson County? Then there would be that handful of people in Jackson County that have a rep from east of the mountains. Walden is retiring, so Hood River County may be in play for redistricting. I guess there's no rule that says you can't district a congressperson out of their district, but it would be kind of rude. So Hood River, some people have speculated that Hood River doesn't have to be in, but that's only about 25,000 people. So there's gonna have to be some more awkwardness to District 2. Eastern Oregon is, by itself, is not gonna be 1/6 of the state.
Commissioner Sorensen?
If the boundary between the 4th district and the 2nd district were changed in southern Oregon to put more of, maybe all of Josephine County and some of Jackson County into the 2nd district, would that bring the 2nd district without changing any of the northern or eastern or central boundaries of the 2nd district, would that be a way to equalize the 6 districts?
Yeah, it would. And if that were to happen, though, then the 4th district would have to receive.
It would lose its mid-Willamette Valley
Right,
population
right. They would
of
lose-
Lynn and Benton counties to create or help create the necessary people for a 6th district if the 3rd district and 1st districts were moved northward.
Right, exactly. So there would be a big swath of everything north of Eugene and south of Portland that would be big enough for 2 districts.
Has the 5th district grown as fast as the 1st and 3rd districts?
Well, according to these estimates, it's grown as fast as the 3rd. These were actually within 1 person of each other after based on the 2010 census. They didn't go for 9.9%. They went for 0.0001% when the legislature redrew these 5 congressional districts.
Is
So-
your part of Portland State University available to work with the legislature or units of government such as Lane County government to help them draw fair districts?
Yeah, actually, we worked with a lot of jurisdictions after 2010, including Washington County, which had not changed its districts for a long time, and they wanted to keep cities together, so they were really out of proportion. You know, Beaverton and Hillsborough each are more than, each one of them is more than 1/5 of the county, so they were well out of proportion, and we helped them redraw their boundaries. We worked with cities such as Pendleton and a lot of community college and school districts. And we didn't work with the legislature except for something similar to what we're doing right now, you know, just talking with the Rules Committee before the census results came out. The legislature plans to hire a GIS analyst to, help them, and probably some consultants, to show them scenarios. So, but again, this is all speculation. They could do things completely differently if they want. Whoops. So here within Lane County, how much of the state's population does Lane County represent? In the 2010 census, it was a little over 9%. So I multiplied it by 60 and 30. This is how many seats you should have in the House and Senate. 5.5 and in the House. And Lane County has grown a little bit more slowly than the state in the last 10 years. But Lane County is still somewhere between 8.8 and 9.1% of the state population. So there will be, House and Senate districts redrawn, but I don't think you'll have a perceptible loss of representation, maybe a quarter of a seat in the House, perhaps. And City of Eugene has continued to grow at a faster rate than the county, and putting the description of 2 seats in Eugene. I just looked at our estimates for the urban growth boundary of Eugene. It represents 53% of the county. And of course, that's a little bit more than the city, representing, including places like Santa Clara and River Road that are not in the city. But urban growth boundary is about, Eugene UGB is about 53%, Springfield UGB is about 19%. So that is 1/5, yes.
Commissioner Sorensen?
Just want to ask about your 53% number for the city of Eugene. Is that,
UGB.
that's the urban growth boundary of Eugene, not the urban growth boundary of Springfield and
Right,
Eugene? Okay.
right.
And then, so just as has been noted earlier, the people who were drafting our charter that was approved by the voters in 1976 used the terms North Eugene and South Eugene. But it sounds like we couldn't actually put the South Eugene and North Eugene districts into that urban growth boundary because that'd be 53% of the whole county. And we can only have 40% in those two seats.
Yeah, and I noticed the.
So 10% or 13% of that urban growth boundary population has to go into the other three districts, or one of, or two of, or three of the other three districts. Is that,
Yeah, and I think your county map already shows that you're already, there's some portion of Eugene that's in a third. There are 3 districts that include some portion of the
Yeah.
city of Eugene.
yeah. Thank you.
In Springfield was 18%, you said?
19%,
19.
including its, I guess, drawing a blank on the little neighborhood between.
Glenwood.
Glenwood, yeah, I think that's within the Springfield
is.
UGB.
So that's inside of the 19%?
Yeah. So, again, not related to redistricting, but, why is the census important? Well, this professor at George Washington University has calculated that Oregon got over $13.4 billion from 55 big federal programs in the year 2016 that are, as he put it, guided by census data. So some of them have different formulas. It's not strictly census data. There's other factors involved in some of the formulas, but Medicaid is the biggest one, about $6.7 million. And again, 4 or 5 years ago, fiscal year 2016, his research team actually broke
Excuse
down.
me,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Is that 6.7 million or billion?
Billion. Yeah, Oregon got $6.7 billion for Medicaid in fiscal year 2016. So, yeah,
I'm sorry, if I may, that's formulaic then? Okay.
yeah, this is a really interesting website. In fact, I don't know if the links will work from the PDF that's on your board agenda, but if you get a copy of the original PowerPoint, there's a lot of links in here so you can look at these sites, and there's a lot more information there, including his team actually broke it down by county from a few of the biggest programs for which they could do that. And Title I grants to local education agencies. Looks like Lane County got a little bit more than its 9.2% share of the state total of state population. Community development block grants and workforce allocations. These are the funds that were guided by population counts. So very important. I'm sure you have a complete count committee that's getting the count as complete as possible.
We just had a presentation on that yesterday.
Okay.
Commissioner Burney, did you have a question?
Yeah, in that you're mentioning the count, I'm sorry to be picky, but it looks like it's 13.5 trillion, not billion, that came to Oregon. Is that correct?
I don't think there's a,
It's billion.
Billion.
Yeah. It's
No, you're right, okay.
yeah, and this pie was
Because then I was adding this up and it adds up to more.
this pie nationally was 675 billion.
Thank you.
But now he's come out with more research, counting not 55 programs, but 316 programs with about $1.4 trillion of federal money that's guided by census data. And he hasn't yet broken it out by state. But we little note up there in the upper right-hand corner, we divided this 13.4 billion by Oregon's population in 2016, and it's more than $3,200 per person. So you can't quite say that each person not counted would cost us $3,200 because the formulas are complicated, but people like to make that claim. It's roughly in that order. More than 30, I think we can say more than $3,200 for every person missed, Oregon would lose out on. Part of my, whenever I talk about the census, I talk about what's changing. Of course, this is going to be the first time that you can report on the internet, and Census Bureau really wants you to do that, save them money. You can also report traditionally by paper and by telephone. Maybe you heard all this in your complete count committee presentation. There are minor changes to the race and ethnicity questions, and some changes to the relationship question, and something that concerns all of us data people is something called differential privacy. And I've got a slide on each one of those. There's a great map out already showing which census tracts will get the internet first. In other words, you get a card in the mail and it tells you to go on the internet. If you don't do that after getting a couple more cards, they'll send you a paper form. So that's almost 3/4 of the state's households that will get a card in English telling you to go on the internet. Another 5.7% will get a card in English and Spanish, depending on what census tract they live in, telling them to go on the internet. And then those green ones, internet choice, they'll get the paper form first, but they still have the choice to go on the internet. And you can zoom in on this map if you fire off this link and see exactly, your neighborhood, and streets will pop up and you'll know what kind of census tract you're in. There's some yellow areas there too, like the Warm Springs Reservation and some really rural areas where they will actually come to your door first and hang a questionnaire there. I don't think there's any in Lane County, but these are areas where there's lots of post office boxes or people who don't have addresses that they can mail to.
Question.
Who made this determination and on what basis?
The Census Bureau, based on broadband access and American Community Survey data, there's a question about broadband access on there. They may have worked with local telecom providers. But my father's 97 years old. He lives in a very sophisticated, well-connected census tract. I don't think he's going to respond by internet, but he will. I can help him, I guess. Or he can wait for the paper form. It'll be interesting to see what happens. There's some concern about this, of course, but there were also people 10 years ago saying, why don't you give us a chance to do it on the internet? Because that's how we do everything. Mostly people under 40. So here's changes to the question that I mentioned. On the left, the two-part question. First, is this person Hispanic, Latino? And then what's the person's race? That hierarchy hasn't changed. Census Bureau actually proposed to merge these into one question and to add a Middle Eastern and North African category. And they sent that proposal. Of course, they studied it for years, tested it, and had stakeholder groups advising them. They sent that proposal to Office of Management and Budget, but OMB ignored it and focused on adding the citizenship question. OMB is part of the executive branch, so they didn't get the changes they wanted to the race question. They're still using the 1997 OMB directive, which lays it out like this. There are some subtle changes though, crossing out the word Negro from Black and African American, crossing out the word Guamanian from Chamorro, and then adding write-in categories. It's always been the case, or for a while it's been the case, if you're Asian or American Indian or Latino, you can write something very specific in those boxes. But for whites and blacks, it was just white or black. But there's a lot of interest in Afro-Caribbean populations, African immigrants, Slavic populations, and I don't know if we're going to get the good data that will help us parcel that out from basically the way that people write stuff in, but there will be, and it won't be available at a very detailed geographic level, but certainly by state or maybe even county, we should be able to see stats like how many people said they were Lebanese, for example, under the white box. So changes to the relationship question. How is this person related to person one? They're now categories of opposite sex spouse and opposite sex unmarried partner, same sex spouse, same sex unmarried partner, rather than just imputing that from the gender question. And then rumor or border, kind of old-fashioned terms, have been deleted, and but roommate or housemate is still there. And fortunately, they added foster child, and you probably have heard from your Complete Count committee folks that children are some among the biggest group of people missed in the census. Lots of children are missed in the census. So I think adding foster child is a great addition because people may not be sure whether they need to count their foster child. Not going to read all this, but differential privacy. Census Bureau is concerned about people being identified. Their Title 13 says that they can't identify any individuals in the census. But now that there's all this big data that you can purchase and run through your computer at billions of bytes per millisecond, they figured out that you could actually match up some of the data that's out there with the published data from the census. They publish so many tables that if you with high-powered computing and integrating other sources, they determined that you could identify many people from the census. So, and they've always had some noise in the census. For example, they swap people from one block to another. I live on a block with only 10 homes on it, and I know I filled out my own census form, but I can tell that my household is not represented on my block based on the race, age, and sex characteristics of my household. And but there are other households that reported on my block that probably don't live on my block. So they, in order to keep people from being identified, they've been swapping them. But they've determined now that doesn't go far enough. So they're actually going to be adding more noise, doing things like changing people's ages, and so that they can't be linked with other databases. It's a big concern for us data folks, and we're pushing back on it.
Do you like accuracy?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we need denominators for our fertility rates and mortality rates and migration rates. So if we don't get people the right age, then we won't be able to calculate good rates. So there's Hard to Count, link to the Hard to Count website that our center created, that's part of the Oregon 2020 census website that the governor's office has put out. And more links if you want to really learn about differential privacy. This YouTube video is the person who created the concept, and she explains it really well. On the last link is something I just added. This just came out, and this compares the 2020 census that was published, 2010 census data that was published, compared to the 2010 census data that would be published using the current rules for differential privacy. And it's really concerning, especially around things like vacancy rate. It's like night and day. And here's the state's website, Oregon2020census.gov, was just rolled out a few weeks ago. And a couple of questions from
Commissioner Sorensen and then Commissioner Britton.
I wanted to ask a question about the estimates that Portland State puts out for the cities and counties in the state, and what you think of the idea of using those estimates from the, let's say, July 1, 2020 estimate to begin the redistricting conversation earlier so that the people could learn more about the population changes and the at least at that time current data in potentially June, July, August, September, until the formal data is released, and that a greater period of time could ensue for the commissioners who are going to have to make the decision, but also the public that's following it could be more engaged in it. How accurate are your numbers, the Portland State numbers, compared to and I guess I'm asking you to project how accurate you think they'll be, but just historically, have they been accurate?
Well,
have they been
not
accurate?
accurate enough to do what you'd like to do. It's
Not accurate.
not accurate enough to do, in generality, I think you can say something like Eugene has been growing faster than the rest of Lake County. That's about it.
Wouldn't we be able to take our 12 cities and compute the number of people
Well,
at your
Well,
estimate?
The other problem though is we don't have detailed estimates for unincorporated areas. So the fact that Florence has X population, that's not gonna really tell us anything about western Lane County in general, because there's so much unincorporated population. And that given the fact that our estimates were based on the 2010 census, incrementally year by year, they will diverge from what comes out in 2020. And in fact, there's even disagreement, I hate to bring it up, but disagreement between our annual estimates and the Census Bureau's annual estimates, and even our own population forecast program, disagreements about what the 2018 population is, for example. So we'll all reset after 2020. No estimate is perfect.
Commissioner Britton.
You said as a data person, you're pushing back against what I think you call noise, which sounds to me like trying to protect people's privacy from data surveillance.
Well,
Is
yeah,
that
Census
correct?
Bureau is trying to protect people's privacy, and the data user community is saying, well, what we've been doing is good enough. I think you're interpreting Title 13 too strictly. So I think, I've heard that they're actually coming out, see, this comparison is with something they call a demonstration product, where they reran the 2010 census using differential privacy. And I think now that they've gotten feedback about how bad it is, they're changing. One of the things they brag about with their differential privacy is that you can set something, you can measure the trade-off between perfect privacy, which would be not releasing any data at all, and perfect perfect data, which is releasing data on every individual. So there's a delta around there that they have to choose, and they may slide it a little bit away from privacy and toward better data.
No, I understand that. The statement is a correct one, and it, now you're talking about people's privacy and data that's commercialized, right, by other groups. And again, the noise ostensibly is to protect that. So I'm just saying, will people have a chance to weigh in on that, or is this an internal discussion and debate?
It's the Census Bureau's decision to make. People like the Minnesota Population Center, which is a great site for publishing additional, pulling census data together. They have been pushing back very vocally, as well as many other people have. There've been conferences on it. There's a lot of pushback, and people are testing it and coming up with case studies of, well, if you use these differential privacy, for example, most of the counties in Eastern Oregon had a 0% vacancy rate in the differential privacy file, when in fact they had like a 10% vacancy rate. Minority communities, vastly different numbers in some cases, and it affects smaller cities a lot worse than bigger cities.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So it's a big concern. But we don't want to scare people from not doing the census. So that's, I guess the general public isn't going to be too concerned about this when they fill out their census form, but I think it'll be a concern for planners and, elected officials and anybody who, community development people, not just demographers.
Any other questions? I do have a question for our first speaker. You had mentioned when you were looking at our information for Lane County that our districts were named by region.
Yeah.
And that was of particular interest to mine because I'm the big chunk on the right, which is East Lane, but I also include South Lane, or people who identify as South Lane. So I have delegated myself to calling it District 5. And it also includes North Lane. So, right. And a portion of West Lane. So it's this huge swath that the name convention really doesn't encompass very well. And I was curious what the practice was that you may have encountered in places that have district.
It's not something I've studied in depth to the extent I'm familiar with it. Usually they're just numbers, not necessarily identifying the numbers with a particular neighborhood or section of a city. I would say I don't know what the charter committee was thinking back in 1976, or if there was much debate about this, but
There was a reason they were, one, named and why they were chosen the way they were, which was to make sure there was at least 2 commissioners that came from outside the Eugene-Springfield metro area.
yeah, and I wonder if at the time, that's when one person, one vote was still fairly fresh, maybe, and still being incorporated into the dialogue.
Well, when you have numbers, that can be very difficult for residents to conceptually understand what number am I in.
Leading up to the home rule charter, we had 3 commissioners under, general
Yeah.
governance, and all 3 were out of the city of Eugene at that time.
Yeah.
That's why it was so specifically set up by geographic region,
Interesting.
why they got named.
I guess the analogy I would make is in, state legislatures, we just give them a number, in Congress. And then whoever it is who gets elected from there, we say D Eugene or R Kaiser, but we don't call Senate District 13 the Kaiser seat.
True.
It could be Kaiser, it could be Wilsonville, it could be, Hillsborough.
Mine is
So-
the Sheldon North Willamette, California district.
I would say the longest lasting approach, or the most durable approach is just to go with numbers. It may have less personality, but it's more durable.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So one point I want to
Yes.
I was unable to get out of my 3:30.
Commissioner Sorensen mentioned December 31st, and I wanted to just point out that the only thing we'll know on December 31st is the total population of Oregon. So we'll know how many, and every other state. So we'll know how many seats in Congress each state will have, but the Census Bureau doesn't release the block level file that you'll need for redistricting until later. The deadline for that is March 31st. 10 years ago, it came in about the 3rd week of February. So they release it state by state on a rolling basis. And that's when you can hit the ground with drawing your boundaries.
Commissioner Sorensen?
With regard to the release of the state-by-state populations in December of this year, do you believe that it'll be known, demographers will know to a reasonable to a reasonable accuracy, that Oregon will get a 6th district? We'll know by then?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. When do you think that actual date will come, or have you already,
December 31st.
Yeah.
have you already come to that view yourself, studying it?
Well, having been around for lots of other censuses, it always comes on December 31st, not a day before.
But I mean, your opinion of whether Oregon is gonna get a 6th district?
Oh, yeah, we'll
Is
get
that like 100% in your mind, or,
99.99 and 44
okay.
hundredths.
And so based
Old enough
on,
to remember
you're saying
that.
based on your current knowledge of the rest of the United States population changes, that you're reasonably confident?
Because Oregon's been growing faster than the US,
Okay,
significantly.
okay. And then, back to my other question about the use of Portland State data.
Yeah.
Currently, do you believe that data is gonna be, in terms of the city population and the county population, do you think those are gonna be relatively accurate?
Well, I think the state population is gonna be very, very, very close.
Mhm.
I'd be disappointed if it was more than 20,000 different.
Mhm.
But cities and counties, they're gonna be different. Some will be too high, some will be too low.
Mhm. Okay,
It's just an inexact science, since in this country we don't require people to register when they move to a new city like they do in some countries, so.
Yep.
Thank goodness.
thank you.
And I'll leave this presentation just for future reference. There's some other final slides in here showing, for example, age group change in Lane County, losing children, gaining old people, and then households. There's actually fewer married couple households with children under 18 now than there have been in the last 60 years. And that shrunk from 49% of all households in 1960 down to 15% of Lane County households in 2010.
Wow.
Number of share living alone increased from 13% in 1960 up to 29% in 2010. So probably by now, close to 1/3 of all households in Lane County are single-person households.
Well, thank you both for coming down and speaking with us today.
Coming up.
Right?
Up the river,
Are you up the river? Okay. Are you coming up the river? Okay.
down on the map.
We just won't know what the numbers are locally until the numbers come out. That's pretty clear. So trying to figure out where our boundaries may or may not change before that time is just gonna be speculation. But I think we do still have a lot of conversation to be had regarding how we want to proceed with the redistricting. You know, what you looked over in our charter, in my personal opinion, is it doesn't really state how we're going to do that. And we should be discussing that further, so that we're ready and prepared. And if we want to make any changes, then we have public input to do so prior to actually redistricting in the future. Any other final comments? Commissioner
Are
Swanson?
you suggesting that we have another work session on this topic, and how would that, in your view, be structured?
I would like to see that, but not necessarily about trying to estimate the population boundary stuff, but talking more in depth about how we want to move forward with the methodology of our redistricting. Commissioner Bozievich?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because I've, you know, after the last round of redistricting, and as hard as you try to do everything according to the rules, you know, it still has the appearance of being self-serving for the, you know, whoever holds the majority of the board at the time. I would really like us to look into the possibility of thinking about putting a charter amendment out on the ballot to look at the possibility of having an independent commission do the redistricting. You know, whether it's, you know, retired judges or appointed by retired judges like they do in some California counties, that has been fairly successful in resolving some of that concern.
Commissioner Bernie?
Did I hear one of you say it's too late to do that for this go-around? Because I also heard the League of Women Voters saying that that was something that they planned to put on a statewide ballot
I
initiative.
may have said my guess is it would take longer than you have. That's just a guess.
For the state, we could refer one for the November ballot and it'd be in place for redistricting next year.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
No, I think all that should be on the table for a future work session, how we want to define it more specifically. I just think we need that definition, because right now it basically just says the five of us get to choose what it is, and
Yep.
that's kind of it. And
Not the five of us.
Yeah. The five
The five in
commissioners.
office at the time.
Yes, because you won't be there, that's,
correct.
yes.
We adopt the new boundaries
That's
by
right.
ordinance, and that's a
Yep.
majority vote.
And I know that there's the league and other, you know, public groups that would want to weigh in on this.
Yeah.
And that we should have that conversation with them as well. Commissioner Bernie?
I know this isn't the topic that you all came here to talk about in terms of the political decision, right? But I think, yeah, I mean, sometimes optics become the problem. And so to the degree that we can mitigate that as an issue, I think that's healthy for our community.
Yeah, and frankly, it could be done at the state level, but it would take the legislature referring something to the ballot to get the timing to work. And I don't think this legislature has any desire to change the system. They like controlling it. They like picking their own voters, which is basically what this requires, is elected officials to pick their voters.
Commissioner Bernie?
I would argue that any group that I've seen in the majority would like the decision
To stay
to
that
pick
way.
their voters. So I think the fact that we're having this discussion is just really good, sound public policy discussion.
Yep.
While our guests are here, could you, either one of you, give your view on what are some good local examples of having the redistricting decision at the city or county level being done by, other than the elected officials?
Well, the ones that our office have done, I think were good examples, and we didn't get any complaints about them. But
Well,
Of
what
course-
were they?
Of course,
What
of course
cities were they?
I mean, they were also proposals that the board or council had to adopt. So, you know, it was still up to the city council or the board of directors or whatever ruling body had to vote to adopt them. But you know, it's possible that us or other agency could present one or more alternative boundaries. And I know in Pendleton, we had an issue with, there's a big prison there. And so and I wasn't actually involved in that project, so I don't know how it was adjudicated, but the prison, if we would have not excluded the prison population, that would be basically like one block would be a council district, so that wouldn't work. But, you know, we've done this after every census for several decades. My office has existed at PSU since 1965.
Well, what I was asking and drilling down on is not who would give us the options, whether you're aware of, like, oh, in Pendleton, they had a redistricting commission, and it wasn't appointed by the city council, or in Umatilla County, the Board of County Commissioners decided that they were gonna have a redistricting commission, and it wasn't appointed by the Board of Commissioners, but it was something that had the exclusive authority to make the decision.
I'd be interested to know if there is any such arrangement anywhere in Oregon. And
Could we
Professor
appoint
Diller said the
Professor
same-
Diller?
I'm not aware of any in Oregon. Now, Nate, you did mention Washington County having to resize its districts.
Yeah, again, it was up to the county board, but I think they realized and that was an interesting case.
And had no one sued as they became more and more out of compliance?
I don't think so. They may have just gotten vocal, objections and
Yeah.
suggestions from people that they ought to take a.
In our case, we have traditionally appointed a 7-member group, which got the title Lane County Redistricting Task Force. We've done that for the last 4 censuses that I'm aware of. And we put, each of the 5 commissioners appoint 1 member to it, and then the board as a group appoints the other 2. And these 7 people work, when the census data comes out, they work for 3 or 4 months, and then prior to the September deadline, which is 6 months before the next primary election, then the Board of Commissioners accepts, rejects, or modifies the recommendations of that 7-member group. Now, that's not, the 7-member group doesn't make the decision, but they typically will make 3 or 4 options for the governing board to adopt or otherwise recommend. So there is some degree of public engagement and expert testimony on it, but it's not quite the same as I think you're describing, where a state of California appoints a group of wise men and women to be on a commission that makes the decision.
Yes.
It doesn't recommend, but it makes the decision.
Right, and they're supposed to be kind of like average Joe citizens was the idea. So they took applications from around the state, thousands of people applied.
Who appoints them?
I can't remember, there's some complex system with like multiple screens to limit partisan influence. Yeah, I can't remember all the details, but it's a model to think about and then scale down to the
Yeah.
county level.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we will adjourn our meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For having us.
Are you kidding? That was great.